Richard Martin, who's the Executive Chairman of Acacia Energy, would have been here to present this. Unfortunately, he couldn't make it today, so he passes on his best wishes to everyone, and you've left with me again, sorry. But this part of it's really important. This is the bit that you actually get to engage with, and electricity bills are complex, the electricity industry is complex, and your business isn't about electricity, it's not core business to you, but there are some fundamental things to understand in your electricity bill and why it's important. And it's all about paying attention to the detail. So on that first page, that's the front page, but this bit, the invoice summary, is probably the bit that you see and go, I'm paying $71,000 a month for electricity, that's a lot of money. What can I do about it? Well, I've contracted it, so move on. You don't open up to the next few pages, but that's really where you get to understand what you can really do about your electricity bill. So on the bill, you'll see under the energy charges there, you'll see in that rate per unit is a cents per kilowatt charge, and that's the bit that you're paying for the consumption, so how much you use. So cents per kilowatts is how much you use. It's a bit like how much you pay for petrol, cents per litre, cents per kilowatt hour. Whoops, sorry. The next piece, which we've got circled in green, is the KVA charge, and this is where people often start to glaze over and start looking at the room or looking around at something else. But the way I think about KVA, this is your demand charge, and demand is really the rate at which you're using electricity. And to me, it's a bit like the toll on the freeway, and if they introduced tolls on freeways that encouraged you to use the freeway when it was not that busy and not use the freeway when it is busy, so you charge what's like a congestion charge. You're paying for the capacity of the electricity that you use and the capacity that the network has been built to transport that electricity. And the electricity network is built to deliver effectively to the highest amount of consumption that is being used over the year. And there's 8,760 hours in a year, and the network is used to its capacity for maybe 12 hours. So they have to build the network and get their money back on that investment, and the way they do that is with these KVA charges as well as the consumption. So the next part on the bill is the energy charges, which is the retail charges, and on this one it's two lines. It's the peak and off-peak, and sometimes you might have shoulder in there as well. This part of the bill, which is probably one of the smallest parts of the bill, this is the only bit that you get to negotiate when you're negotiating with a retailer. Everything else is set through regulation. This bit is the bit that you're negotiating with your electricity retailer. And it's all in cents per kilowatt hour, so you work out the rate that you're going to pay, and this is 6.5 or 6.6 for peak, 4.9, nearly 5 for off-peak, and that's what you're actually paying for your electricity. Then there's the network charges, and the network charges, these are set by where you are and the electricity network that you're connected to. You don't get to negotiate this, it's really set based on your connection and the regulated tariff that the Australian Energy Regulator has approved that network operator will charge for a connection of your particular type. And this has the KVA charge, which is the demand charge. There's a service charge in terms of some that are $1 per day, and then there's a cents per kilowatt charge. So if you reduce your consumption, you'll reduce your cents per kilowatt hours. If you reduce your demand, you will reduce your KVA, but only to a point because of the way the KVA charge works, which if we look at this slide, in terms of the KVA, typically what they do is when you use your demand, whatever your maximum demand has been in a 12-month period, it ratchets up to whatever the maximum was in the 12-month period, and that stays with you for a whole 12-month period, and then it looks back, what was the previous highest amount. So on this chart here, you'll see at the left of the chart, that must have been their maximum demand at whatever point it was. The following month, they used a bit more in terms of demand, so it stepped up. The following month, they used a lot more, and it stepped up. And even though their demand reduced over the remaining months, their charge stayed at that high level, and it will stay there for 12 months. And then it will eventually be reset to whatever the previous highest was. So it'll step down and then step back up again. That's the way the KVA charge works with the networks. And if you have a peak every year in about the same month, you never get out of that cycle of paying for that highest price all the way through. So there's an area where you can focus on doing that. Then there's the regulated charges and the environmental charges. Regulated charges are essentially set by AEMO, the market operator. Every retailer gets the privilege of paying these to AEMO and collecting the money to pay this to AEMO. It's the cost of having a market operator do their job. And the environmental charges are all of the environmental schemes that various governments will run. Some are national, some are jurisdictional. But as a retailer, if you're purchasing fossil fuel from generation and then on-selling that to customers, you have to buy certificates to offset the carbon intensity of the electricity you're supplying, and that cost comes through to you as a customer through these environmental charges. So that's the way that works as well. And again, that's not something to negotiate. That you can choose your retailer, or you can choose to go green, and you might not end up with any of these charges, but if they're buying fuel through the grid and supplying it to you, they will be passing on these charges as well. So out of that, we're off to, it's a quick fleet through what your bill is, but it's important to get that understanding, and we have another poll.
Yep, so please, if you can go back into your devices, the next question you should see is, out of total OPEX, how does your energy consumption rank in your business? So whilst we're giving people some time to answer that question, I think it's probably a timely point to raise. Throughout our presentation, Steve, what I've noticed is that businesses, no matter what stage of the company that they're sitting in, whether they're in the maintenance section, whether they're in procurement, whether they're the CFO, the CEO, the managing director, when we go through the price stack that you've just mentioned, it gets them by surprise when they realise that a third of their bill is contracted and the rest is obligated. So, in your experience, what do you think, and we'll get into tackling what we can do about that at a later stage, but what do you think has been the most aha moment for businesses when they're looking at their electricity bills? And the reason why I'm asking that question is because that's the first starting point before we start our journey around what we can do to make an informed decision about improving that outcome.
Well, I think it's really that getting that understanding that of those components, the retail is the only bit that you can negotiate, and that's basically half the bill. So I didn't really talk about the quantum components, but the retail bill, which is the bit that you negotiate, that's half the bill. The other half is fixed, and you can't do anything about it really in terms of negotiating a different outcome. Your behaviour will be different, but there's no negotiation around those components. So you've got half the bill that you can do something about, and just that fact of the way that the bills are structured, once you go past that first invoice summary and into the detail, first thing people do is look at it and think there's way too many lines here for me to bother about, because, and it's not like telcos who deliberately set up their charges to make it hard. It's the regulation process has been set up and makes it hard, and people then look at it and go, too much information, don't have enough time, I'll go away and do something else. But once you understand that you can only really impact half of it through negotiation, but then the other half is all, I've got to change my behaviour in the way that I use my electricity or source my electricity, that's the thing.
Very good. So that really leads itself into the second question, which is which part of the price stack do you think that businesses should start focusing on, outside of the electricity charges? We'll get into tackling that a little bit later.
Well, it depends on your business, I guess, is something, because you've got a cents per kilowatt hour charge and you've got a demand charge. It really depends on what your business is doing. If you're a seasonal user of electricity and you have a peak demand in a defined period of the year and then you drop off, and wineries are a classic example of that. A winery will use, in the vintage season, they will use a lot of electricity, and then for the rest of the year they're chugging along, not using very much, just running the cool store and things like that. But in that vintage period they use a lot. If they can look at that and say, well, why would I pay a really high price and be stuck with that for the demand? What can I do about changing my demand? Whereas if you're a business that's got a fairly constant demand, what can I do to offset the grid electricity and start providing that by myself behind the meter?
Okay, thank you, Steve. Let's have a look at what the responses were.
Yeah.
Interesting.
So total OPEX, the majority of people are thinking, around 60% of people are thinking that it's the third most important bill on their OPEX spend. And that's pretty much what I would expect.
Yeah.
But top three.
Yeah.
And very few people, it's less than the top three. So most of the people listening in and here in the room, it's in the top three costs of the business to deal with your electricity as an input cost.
Yep.
And as we said before, it's rising at more than 30, more than 50% over the next few years as you recontract.
Very good. Thank you, Steve. Appreciate your time. Thank you, Steve.